Good evening. I'm Chris Brown, the acting director of the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. For those of you with us in person here in the Airbus IMAX Theater, welcome to the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center. If it's your first time here, I hope you'll come back to explore all the treasures we have on display. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural Amelia Earhart Lecture in Aviation History. Earhart was a true giant of early aviation, a pioneer in human flight, and a barrier breaker throughout her career. Her aviation records, determination to pursue her passion, and of course, her mysterious disappearance make her a subject of fascination to this day. This lecture series explores and celebrates figures in aviation that charted their own course, succeeded where others thought they could not, or redefined what it means to be a pilot or aviator. This week marks an important milestone as May 20th is the 90th anniversary of her historic transatlantic flight as the first woman to fly nonstop and solo across the Atlantic. So it's appropriate time to reflect on her legacy. While much has been said about her, we continue to expand our understanding of who she was and the impact she had. Our speaker tonight, biographer Susan Ware, has examined Earhart's life through the lens of women's history, particularly the field of feminist biography. In that light, we gather more insights into the richness and most compelling aspects of Earhart's life. Susan was a pioneer in her own right in the field of feminist biography, and today is the general editor of the American National Biography. She's the author and editor of multiple books and has taught at both New York University and Harvard. Before we start, I want to thank our great friends at Pratt & Whitney who have been our generous sponsor for our marquee annual aviation lecture for many years and again tonight. We appreciate you helping us continue to share aviation history and share it with our audiences in person and anywhere online. If you'll join me. And our thanks to all of you who are here with us tonight and joining us online for our first Earhart Lecture. So without further delay, please join me in a warm welcome for Susan Ware.
Let me get settled up here. End of slideshow. Help. I go backwards. Right. Now, did you take my clicker? Promise you it will get better. So I want to thank you for that introduction and for inviting me to give the inaugural Amelia Earhart Lecture in Aviation History. I'm honored and a little humbled by the task ahead. One of the tricks of writing biography is picking your subjects well. And luckily, I hit the jackpot with Amelia Earhart. And I say good thing, too, because there continues to be so much popular interest in her that I swear I will be fielding inquiries about her until the day that I die. But I often ask myself how many historical figures, male or female, have such a grip on the popular imagination. Amelia Earhart seems to never go out of style. And part of the appeal is certainly visual. I'm convinced that if she walked into this lecture hall tonight, she would look perfectly at home, dressed in comfortable but flattering slacks with an easy-to-care-for hairstyle and a trim athletic build, a style that is perfectly suited for today's gender-blending fashion sensibilities. Of course, it doesn't hurt that she is at the center of one of the 20th century's greatest unsolved mysteries. Barely a year goes by without a new theory or piece of evidence about her fate. As long as the public stays tuned, the search will go on. Now, without denying the compelling nature of her fateful last flight, I think there are other reasons why Amelia Earhart continues to fascinate and inspire modern audiences. It is the life, not the death, that counts. And gender really does matter here. Both Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh flew because they loved the freedom of the skies, and both flew to promote public acceptance of commercial aviation. But Amelia Earhart had an additional reason for flying that she did not share with Colonel Lindbergh. She flew for women. As a female aviator, Amelia Earhart symbolized the new opportunities for women, consciously identifying her individual successes as victories for womanhood as a whole, and thus offering a challenge, albeit a highly individualistic one, to traditional gender roles. And that message, which has a lot to do with modern feminism, is still relevant today. And I chose as the title for my biography, Still Missing, a phrase which has multiple and open-ended meanings. The most literal, of course, is the fact that no conclusive evidence of Amelia Earhart's remains or wreckage from her plane have been found since she disappeared on her round-the-world flight in 1937. The unsolved mystery has spawned numerous theories about her fate, with new scenarios, search expeditions, and supposed facts surfacing on a regular basis. And Amelia Earhart may be even more famous today than she was at the height of her flying career, and the fascination shows no sign of abating. Amelia Earhart was still missing, I concluded, despite the numerous books that had looked at her life. Unlike Charles Lindbergh, who has been the subject of many serious historical treatments, the telling of Amelia Earhart's life has more often been the province of journalists, aviators, family members, and more than a few crackpots and publicity seekers. Few of these books were grounded in the specific historical context of the 1920s and 30s, nor tried to relate her life to broader trends in 20th century history. And yet, Amelia Earhart was very much part of the history of modern America. She was an influential figure in the development of mass culture and the merchandising of popular figures. She participated in the emergence of aviation as a major transportation industry, and she symbolized the new opportunities for women in modern life. And it is through the lens of women's history, especially the field of feminist biography, that Earhart's life looks the richest and most compelling. A feminist interpretation of her life, one that she herself would have endorsed, does not dramatically change the details or the outcome of her story. She's still born in Kansas in 1897. She never finishes college. She works as a social worker in Boston in the 1920s, flies the Atlantic twice, in 1928 as a passenger, and in 1932 solo, marries her promoter, G.P. Putnam, in between, and disappears on a round-the-world flight over the Pacific in 1937. But a feminist interpretation of her life shifts the field of focus, with particular aspects of Earhart's life emerging as markers, as places worthy of pausing and lingering, while more familiar parts of her story can be quickly sped over. In such a retelling, for example, the actual details of her record-setting flying career give way for an emphasis on her quest for a full and productive life, her remarkably modern marriage, and her role as an inspiration to other women. This slight shift in priorities opens up previously unexplored connections between the story of this unique individual and the broader patterns of 20th century women's lives. But it also stretches the boundaries of biography. Now, I will be the first to admit that I did not uncover a single new fact or piece of evidence about Amelia Earhart's life. But what I did was to arrange the facts we know in a different order. And what this adds up to is a different kind of history and a different kind of biography. And this, of course, I would argue, is what feminist scholarship has been doing all along. So the thesis of my book is the following. In the 1920s and 30s, Amelia Earhart helped to sustain the momentum of the women's movement in a period without active feminism. Earhart is a perfect embodiment of the individualistic approach to women's advancement that predominated in the post-suffrage era. During a period when feminism was supposedly dead, she consistently identified her personal achievements as victories for women as a whole. By her widely publicized accomplishments and non-traditional lifestyle, she suggested that women could be autonomous human beings, could live life on their own terms, and could overcome conventional barriers. Coverage of Earhart's exploits in aviation, plus widely distributed images of her in and out of flying gear, worked as a challenge to traditional status quo definitions of femininity and gender roles. And such messages, while not always specifically labeled feminism, provided a highly individualistic route for exceptional women to excel and kept feminism alive in a period when it is often assumed to have been dormant, off course, or irrelevant. And this kind of individualistic feminism, which I identify as liberal feminism, may in fact be more the norm, at least in the United States, than the moments of collective activism represented by the women's suffrage movement or the revival of feminism in the 1960s and 70s. Women, and no doubt a few men, have been drawn to Amelia Earhart's example ever since. Now, sometimes I have been asked, or probably challenged is a better word, how do I really know that Amelia Earhart considered herself a feminist? And I usually point to her membership in the National Woman's Party and the fact that she personally lobbied President Herbert Hoover in 1931 to support the Equal Rights Amendment, which we still do not have, I might add. I might also mention that she kept her own name when she married. And if pressed to define feminism, I would trot out Eleanor Roosevelt's straightforward 1935 definition. This is a quote. "Fundamentally, the purpose of feminism is that a woman should have an equal opportunity and equal rights with any other citizen of the country," end of quote. Now, that's not the only definition of feminism. It's what I would call kind of lowest common denominator feminism, but it's a definition very well suited to the 1920s and 30s, and one which Earhart consistently and publicly endorsed in her writings, her features, and other public appearances. And Earhart's feminist philosophy can be boiled down to two ideas. First, that women can achieve whatever they set out to do. And second, that it should be the ability of the individual, not the sex, that counts. To support the first proposition, this is a quote from her, "There is no reason why women can't hold any position in aviation, providing she can overcome prejudice and show ability." I always had in my mind that that's a pretty big if, Amelia. But to support the second, another quote, "I'd rather have you think of me just as a pilot, an ordinary pilot," she told a newspaper interviewer in 1932. "It doesn't matter whether it's Mr. or Miss Earhart." So Earhart's whole stance towards opening the field of aviation to women, indeed all public life and the professions, attests to these two dual thrusts. As she said of her flight across the Atlantic in 1928, "Probably my greatest satisfaction was to indicate by example now and then that women can sometimes do things themselves if given the chance." Summing up her credo, she wrote in the posthumously published Last Flight, "I, for one, hope for the day when women will know no restrictions because of sex, but will be individuals free to live their lives as men are free." As she said prophetically, "Women must try to do things as men have tried. When they fail, their failure must be a challenge to others." So this philosophy in which the goal is equality of opportunity and the stance is individualistic represents the essence of liberal feminism, a tradition which stretches all the way back to Mary Wollstonecraft and Harriet and John Stuart Mill, all the way up to Betty Friedan and the National Organization for Women in the 1960s. This vision of individual achievement, equal opportunity, and political equality was especially appealing to generations of women coming of age after the passage of the 19th Amendment, giving women the vote. Now that equality had supposedly been achieved, it was up to individual women to strive and succeed. Getting that foot inside the door, or I guess inside the cockpit, would be enough to break down barriers. It didn't turn out to be so easy, unfortunately, but that did not keep these women from trying. And although the inadequacies of this vision are readily apparent, English suffragist Eleanor Rathbone dismissed it as Me Too feminism, and others have called it piece of the pie feminism. It was well suited to the generations of women coming of age after suffrage had been won. This appeal was especially effective in the 1920s and 30s, but it even sustained itself in the far more hostile climate of the 1940s and 50s. And in fact, this kind of individualistic liberal feminism may be more the norm, at least in a country like the United States, than the mass movements of the 1910s or the 1970s. Amelia Earhart's strongly articulated message of individual achievement thus becomes an important piece of the story of the survival of feminism in the post-suffrage era. Now, Amelia Earhart's liberal feminism also had a private dimension, but in keeping with general liberal philosophy, this private side was far less developed than the public. Just as the aviator used her own accomplishments to lead by example, so too did she generalize from her private life when formulating her egalitarian views of marriage as a partnership between equals and individuals. And this is a picture of Amelia and her husband, G.P. Putnam, that they truly do look like equals striding off into the future. She was convinced that wives with outside interests, including employment, made better marital partners. A quote from her, "I believe both men and women should be in the home some of the time and out of it some of the time. 50-50. It's by no means as cooperative a world as it should be, but it's coming fast." Now, Amelia Earhart had been quite reluctant to marry at all, fearing that marriage would put an end to her hard-won independence and provide an impediment to her self-fulfillment. And in the early 20th century, this was not an unrealistic fear, as there were very few models for combining marriage and career. Lore has it that G.P. Putnam proposed 6 times before she finally said yes in 1931. But on the eve of her marriage, she handed him a remarkable document that asked for her freedom in a year if the marriage did not work out. The letter paralleled a modern prenuptial agreement, except that it negotiated freedom and autonomy rather than financial assets. I suspect that he gulped and wondered what in the world he was getting into, but to his credit, GP accepted her less than enthusiastic entrance into the wedded state and proceeded with the ceremony. Now, I'm not exactly a big fan of G.P. Putnam. I suspect he will get a much more sympathetic portrayal in Laurie Gwen Shapiro's forthcoming biography, which should be out next year. But I do believe that together they worked out a mutually satisfying business and personal relationship. The business, of course, being promoting her. GP was enormously important to her career. Having a full-time promoter is one reason why Amelia Earhart is so well known today as an aviation pioneer, whereas other equally talented pilots such as Jacqueline Cochran, Eleanor Smith, and Bobby Trout are all but forgotten. I also think that supportive male feminists, men who not only put up with a wife's career, but actively supported it, were few and far between in the 1930s. If Amelia Earhart were ever going to marry, it would have to be a union such as this. And 2 things stand out about Amelia Earhart's feminist view of marriage. First, her model of equality in marriage was enormously class-bound. As in so many other aspects of her public pronouncements, a model based on and mainly available to privileged members of the white middle class was held up as a universally attainable ideal. Despite the Great Depression, Amelia and G.P. Putnam enjoyed an exceptional level of financial security. They were not necessarily wealthy, but they made and spent a lot of money. And one byproduct of their affluence was being able to afford household help, so that much of the domestic work that usually devolves to women could be conveniently, almost invisibly, relegated to servants. The following statement reads quite differently when one realizes that the cheery partnership that Amelia describes depends on a household of servants. Here's the quote. "If George wants to see a new movie, we dash out and see it. If I've designed a new dress, I try it on and get his judgment. He's so good around the house. We never worry over who ought to do what. More people should try that way of living. Women should know the grind of a job and men the drudgery of housework. There would be fewer misunderstandings." Sure sounds good to me. I think it's also highly relevant that theirs was a marriage without children. with their full-time careers and hectic traveling schedules, to say nothing of the occasional daring and dangerous long-distance flights that she threw in, it would have been far more difficult to include children in this happy picture of an active and egalitarian marriage. Amelia loved children, other people's, that is, and she supported birth control for family planning and the right of mothers to work, but she rarely talked concretely about the changes that parenting would mean for women and men's lives, other than to wish that men would get more involved in the domestic or familial side of life. In terms of her own personal priorities, she seems to have intuitively sensed that her model of unencumbered freedom was at odds with the domestic commitments of child-rearing. But like liberal feminism in general, she always prioritized the public over the private. As her sister Muriel once observed pointedly, she certainly would have been a different person if she'd had a baby to tie her down. But enough about feminism for now. Let's talk about Amelia Earhart and another F word, flying. You didn't really think that I would stand up here, of all places, and never mention flight, did you? In many ways, whoops, that went too far. No, it didn't. In many ways, Amelia straddled two eras in aviation, that of the barnstorming, record-breaking pilot whose aviations, his and hers, whose exploits, his and hers, received as much coverage as the World Series or a championship boxing match, and then the next stage represented by the emergence of a commercial aviation industry in the United States. Many of the opportunities that came her way and some of the constraints were grounded in the broader developments of aviation in the 1930s. One of the most significant was the way in which gender affected the course of modern aviation. It's a quote, "We pilots have a rough, rocky road ahead of us," she explained to fellow pilot Louise Thaden. "Men do not believe us capable. We can fly, you know that. Ever since we've started, we've butted our heads against a stone wall. Manufacturers refuse us planes. The public have no confidence in our ability. If we had access to the equipment and training men had, we could certainly do as well. Thank heaven, we continue willingly fighting a losing battle. But if enough of us keep trying, we'll get someplace." As she noted somewhat more cheerfully on another occasion, women have opened so many doors marked impossible that I don't know where they'll stop. But despite the barriers early pioneering women aviators faced, they did not feel inferior, downtrodden, or for the most part bitter. Their celebration of individual achievement bound them together and kept them going despite the odds. More than anything else, these women wanted to be judged as human beings, as individuals, rather than women. And these are some of the images of these early women pilots, but let's also listen to their voices. Jackie Cochran, "But I never really wanted to copy men or to do what men can or should do better. I only wanted to be myself, and for me, that meant flying." Eleanor Smith, "All I wanted was some way that I could hang in there and fly, and I wanted to do it on merit, and not because I was a girl or 17 years old, or for any of the other reasons the reporters imagined. I wanted to be judged on my piloting skills alone." Or Amelia Earhart herself, "I'm not out for any speed record, but I do want to prove that there is no reason why a woman can't fly from here to New York nonstop as well as a man." As she said pointedly, "How is a fellow going to earn spurs without at least trying to ride?" Now, many of Amelia Earhart's public activities between 1928 and 1937 were directed at overcoming popular fears about commercial aviation, especially women's supposed resistance to flying. Vocal salesmanship was how she described her extensive speaking tours to promote aviation to women's clubs, college women, professional organizations, men's group, and anyone who would listen. She often began her lectures by asking for a show of hands of how many in her audience had flown. And she even did this once in a prison, and a surprising number of inmates' hands went up. And to the doubters, she had a simple challenge: try flying. She was not simply trying to drum up passengers for the airlines. She sincerely believed that American women could play a vital role in the acceptance and promotion of flying, and conversely, that if they were ignorant or non-cooperative, they would hold back its promising future. And this is an image of her after she's done one of her flights, record-breaking flights in 1935. The best example of air-mindedness Amelia Earhart had in mind was that of Eleanor Roosevelt. The First Lady made a point of traveling by air on official or personal business whenever she could, always making sure to follow up by casually plugging air travel in her press conference or in her daily newspaper column discussing the event. She even consulted with Earhart about getting a pilot's license until FDR nixed the idea. Bad, Franklin. But the two women quickly became fast friends, and Amelia and George Putnam were frequent visitors at the White House. After one formal dinner in 1933, just a month after the inauguration, Eleanor Roosevelt, her brother Hall, Amelia, and George slipped away to a nearby airport, still dressed in evening clothes, for Eleanor Roosevelt's first night flight. The escapade was written up in admiring tones in the next day's newspapers by members of the female press corps who went along for the ride. Now, aviation was a new profession, seemingly free from the gender expectations and sex typing that limited women elsewhere. Women were getting in near the beginning, yet the deck was stacked against them. From hindsight, it is clear that the industry developed along sex-segregated lines that marginalized women, and that we are still trying to catch up. To be sure, as epitomized by the women who founded the 99s in 1929, individual women found opportunities in this new profession, and many embraced the freedom of the skies, making the 1920s and 30s something of a golden age for the woman pilot. But at the end of the decade, women pilots had been excluded from the next stage of development, that of commercial aviation, and their marginalization was cemented by World War II. The post-war world of aviation was very much a man's world, although strong-minded and talented women continued to play a role. What place Amelia Earhart might have taken in the aviation industry had she returned from her round-the-world flight in 1937 remains a fascinating cause for speculation. My ongoing interest in Amelia Earhart is broader than just using her life to examine modern feminism and the history of aviation. I'm also interested in the interplay between popular culture in the 1920s and 30s and Earhart's career. Amelia Earhart found many ways to get across her message of feminist liberation and independence in interviews, on the lecture circuit, over the radio, in articles and newspaper columns. Sometimes she did not even need to open her mouth. She let photographic images do the talking. Amelia Earhart was one of the most easily recognized public figures of the 1930s, and arguably she still is today. She once made a forced landing in an isolated rural area in Mexico, and though she spoke no Spanish and the locals spoke no English, they knew who she was. Through photographs and newsreels, she offered the public a highly individualistic yet compelling new way to be a woman. She presented herself and was presented in the press in almost iconographic representation of both woman and aviator. As an aside, I've often wondered if Amelia Earhart would have been so popular if she had been short and dumpy. What if she had had stringy hair instead of the tousled curls towards which the press developed practically a fetish? What if she hadn't looked so spookily like Charles Lindbergh? And remember that slide I showed earlier. In 20th century popular culture, image is everything. Like movie stars, Amelia Earhart was box office, someone the public could not get enough of, and they still can't. Now, no messages in the media or popular culture are neutral or gender-free. In Earhart's case, her widely distributed iconographic image served to challenge and potentially to subvert traditional notions of women's subordination by sidestepping women's total identification with the home and family without abandoning womanliness entirely. What a film historian said of Katharine Hepburn applies equally well to Amelia Earhart. She offers an intriguing demonstration of an acceptance of sexual difference combined with a refusal of sexist inequalities. Earhart claimed the public space not just as an individual, but as a woman. And she claimed it not just for herself, but for womankind as a whole. And this iconographic image was and is remarkably powerful. In photographs and newsreels, Amelia is in motion. She flies planes, she greets crowds, she gives speeches, she meets famous people. Even when photographed standing still, she is often surrounded by symbols of action and power usually associated with men. Sleek cars, large airplanes, crowds of admirers. But the message she conveys is not simply an aping of traditional male values or even male attire. She appears in flight clothes, but also wearing evening gowns, coveralls, but also silk blouses. By her appearance, manner of presentation, and propensity to stare forthrightly into the camera instead of shyly averting her eyes in the more traditional female gaze, Amelia Earhart helped subvert 1930s gender roles. And what's interesting when one surveys the popular culture of the interwar years is that Amelia Earhart was not the only woman so represented in the media. In the 1920s and 30s, it was not unusual for women to win public acclaim or to be in the public spotlight. Like Amelia Earhart, popular heroines such as Dorothy Thompson, Gertrude Ederle, Eleanor Roosevelt, Katharine Hepburn, and Margaret Bourke-White served as role models and examples of what women could accomplish in the modern world. They may not have called themselves feminists or consciously identified with the cause of women, but by the very fact of their gender, they drew attention to women's ever-widening roles in modern life. If they could do it, so could other women, a message that was especially important in a period lacking an active feminist movement. One of my favorite quotes comes from an 18-year-old factory girl from the Tennessee Hills who said of Eleanor Roosevelt, "Say, she's swell. Why, I'm not ashamed of being a girl anymore." And Amelia Earhart's appeal makes much more sense when placed in this broader context. The interwar constellation of popular heroines collectively functioned as role models for wider and more fulfilling lives for women than society usually allowed. Even if a woman couldn't realistically expect to fly the Atlantic, as did Amelia, meet with Hitler, as did Dorothy Thompson, or win an Oscar, as did Katharine Hepburn, at least she could identify with someone who had. And so these prominent and widely publicized female figures who dotted the landscape of the first half of the 20th century suggested alternative and exciting ways of being women. And a few women like Amelia Earhart were even more forthright. Earhart consciously identified herself as a feminist and proudly served as a role model for individual women who wanted to break free of earthbound conventions. Her philosophy of trying things out, accepting challenges, breaking down barriers, and never taking no for an answer could be profoundly liberating, indeed revolutionary, if someone decided to use Earhart's life as a model of her own. If feminism was her message, then popular culture was her medium. Oh, I lost my last slide. This July will mark the 125th anniversary of Earhart's birth. The cult surrounding her disappearance shows no signs of abating, but that's not the only reason she continues to fascinate us today. Even though we will probably never know what happened on Amelia Earhart's fateful last flight, I am convinced that we can probe more deeply into the meaning and legacy of her short but enormously rich life. Amelia Earhart was very much of her times and yet also ahead of her times. Her feminist message still seems fresh and compelling today. Women are the equals of men, and both sexes should have equal opportunities. There are no limits to what women can accomplish if given the chance. Women and men must learn to live together as equal partners. Yet even as my recasting of Amelia Earhart's story restores her to her rightful place in the history of modern American feminism, there remains one final, indeed ironic twist to my title. The equality and opportunities that Amelia Earhart tirelessly promoted for women are, alas, still missing. Just as the search continues for relics of Earhart's plane from the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean, so too does the quest for women's equality. Thank you. Dorothy. And we are going to take questions in this new hybrid world we live in, questions from real people here in the audience and also from those who are turning in online. So let me move over there. You should introduce yourself.
I'm Dorothy Cochran, a curator here at the Air and Space Museum. And Susan, that was great. We have several questions coming from our viewers online, so we're going to start with a few of them. Do you want to take a
No, I'll listen.
first?
I can
Okay.
listen and sip at the same time.
All right. Well, here's the great question that really, why are we here? What was Amelia's greatest achievement?
Well, I think she would answer in several ways. If she was talking about her greatest aviation achievement, it certainly would have been her 1932 solo that we're about to have the 90th anniversary of next weekend, soon.
Friday, I believe.
Which she was only the second person after Lindbergh to have made that flight. Mm-hmm. And I think that if she hadn't been lost on the round-the-world flight in 1937 and had just lived out the course of her life, I think that's what we would have really focused on. Mm-hmm. How she might have also defined her impact more broadly than just aviation, I am convinced that she was very aware of her impact on especially young women and girls, that she really went out of her way to show them that there was a different way of growing up and being a girl, and not to let anybody tell you that you can't do it. And I think she would have hoped that that would have been her legacy. I fear if she were here with us tonight, she might be a little discouraged that we haven't gotten further along on that path. But we're definitely moving in the right direction, but there's still so much to do.
And that leads to the next question. That was a very good lead-in. What does the speaker think Amelia Earhart would say about today's equality of opportunity? Have we made progress?
Well, we've certainly made progress. And yet, I've just come off of being very involved in events around the centennial of the 19th Amendment, giving women the vote. And it's clear that an enormous amount has happened for women in politics and public life in those 100 years. And yet, at the same time, we're nowhere near equality. And I think it's this conundrum. It's the glass half full, half empty. And I think one of the things that I've learned as a feminist and as a scholar is that feminism is an ongoing process. It will always be necessary, and we just have to keep part of it. But I take strength in knowing that we all have foremothers like the suffragists and Amelia Earhart, who were fighting those battles.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. If anyone in the audience has some questions, there is a microphone up there, and it's in the center, in the middle of the aisle up there, and so we encourage you to go there if you have a question. The microphone is up there so that you can be heard online. So that's. Is this okay? Well, I don't know if they can hear you online. I guess that's the point.
Or you could repeat
I can
the
repeat
question.
it if you want me to.
Oh, yes, please. Dr. Ware, you look in a broader sense at the history of feminism. Maybe speak for a moment about the relationship between technological innovation and women empowerment and the rise of feminism in the 20th century?
The question is about the relation between technology and women's empowerment. And it's a complicated question because in some ways, technology does not depend on the physical differences between men and women. There's no advantage to being a man with so much of what it is. And so it ought to be a great equalizer. And yet, it hasn't really worked out that way. And women have struggled, I think, even more in areas of STEM and technology than they have in other areas. And I think a lot of that gets back to a combination of lack of encouragement and also just the difficulty if you don't see people who look like yourself, and this is true of women, people of color, in the positions that you're aspiring to, it's really easy to get discouraged and think, oh, I couldn't possibly do that. And of course, that's why Amelia Earhart was so brilliant, because she was saying, look, I did it, follow me. And I think we need more examples like that, but there also need to be institutional programs put in place to encourage girls and women early on. There probably need to be ways to make careers in aviation technology, engineering, easier for women to combine with marriage and family. And remember the point I made about, can you really imagine Amelia Earhart with a small child? No, you can't. And that is a structural limit that has to be addressed. And the rewards are we get to use the whole population, not just half of it. And I am convinced that Amelia Earhart, if she were still alive today, she would be, again, just trying to get the message across of give women and girls a chance, give them the encouragement, see what they can do. But I think it's really up to all of us to see what we can do to make that happen.
Another question is, or a statement, I would like to hear more from Susan on George P. and how history may judge him in relation to Amelia.
Well, you know, as I kind of alluded to, I'm so fond of Amelia, and I find her feminism and her what she accomplished in aviation so compelling. And GP, George Palmer Putnam, was very important to her, and I admit that, but he could be kind of a pest. And a lot of the other women aviators really did not like him very much. And he was the one who was always kind of horning in to make sure that Amelia was in the center of the photograph and sort of pushing the other women off to the sidelines. And for obvious reasons, they didn't like that. I also, while I gave him credit for being a feminist, I do think he was kind of playing the role of being supportive Amelia Earhart's husband for much of the 30s when he was married to her. But I also have to admit that he was enormously important to her career, and that when people describe them together, they seem to have a very mutually satisfactory relationship. And I think the open question is, if she had come back from her last flight, would this have been a long-lived marriage? And, you know, like with so many other questions about Amelia Earhart, we just don't know. We don't have that last chapter of her life, and boy, do I miss it.
Yeah. Well, 8-year-old Juliana asks how long it took Amelia to train as a pilot.
Well, I think one thing to remember is training as a pilot, she was also training as aviation was even emerging. It's not quite like today, but she had fallen in love with flying during World War I when she saw male flyers and determined that she wanted to do it, and took flying lessons from a woman instructor because she felt she would be more comfortable. And Dorothy, you may know this, it took her, what, a year of lessons to learn?
Yeah.
But I think it's safe to say that for her and for so many other women who learned to fly in those years, and I'm sure for the men too, there was just something about the excitement and freedom of going up in an airplane. And it was all so new, and it just must have been amazing. And for a woman to do that, I think it just must have been intoxicating to have those kind of opportunities. And once you get bit by that bug, I don't think it really goes away, does it?
No.
It doesn't.
No, yeah. We've got a question over here.
Did she hold as much political importance or controversy as her counterpart Charles Lindbergh did?
The question is about Amelia Earhart's political influence. She, except for feminism, she was not really all that involved in politics. She did, because she was such close friends with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, she did support FDR when he ran for re-election in 1932. I haven't found any evidence of her, of who she supported in 28 or 1932. She also was fundamentally opposed to war and identified very strongly as a pacifist. And I think, again, one of those unanswered questions about her was, what would she have done when World War II broke out? You know, someone like Eleanor Roosevelt also had expressed strong pacifist views, but she came around to the view that the war was necessary. But Amelia Earhart certainly never took the kind of public stands that Charles Lindbergh did that have caused his reputation in the years since to decline, whereas hers, I think, has risen.
And speaking of which, in that era, if she had survived, how do you think she would have supported the U.S. in World War II? Would she have worked with Jacqueline Cochran and the WASP, or stayed out as a pacifist?
I think she probably would have come around to the war effort. What do you think?
I think just the goal of seeing women flying would have appealed and helping with that.
Yeah, and also World War II was
And it was important.
a war worth fighting in many ways, and I think she would have felt that.
Here's the question that we like to ask people. If you were to have dinner with Amelia, what would you discuss or ask her?
Well, we talk about feminism, of course, because I don't know much about aviation. I mean, probably for most of this audience, you'd be sitting here asking her about the Pratt Whitney engine that she had on her bag and say, I got in that plug. And be talking of, all this, what's it called, ground flying and all of that.
Hangar flying.
I can't do that. I'm not one who's ever been really bitten by the aviation bug, but I think I would have just been so interested to listen to her, to hear what she said. People who talked to her said that she was just so much fun to be around, so interesting to talk to. And some of the best recollections we have, she was a career counselor at Purdue University, which brings us back to our technology theme that we're coming around to tonight. Purdue at that point, I think it was probably 6 men to every woman, very male-dominated campus. And she was invited by the Dean of Women to come and live in one of the dorms and sort of be a role model to the women. And the undergraduates just couldn't get enough of her. And just being able to see this modern woman. They also loved that she was able to get away with wearing pants to dinner, something that they were not allowed by their house mother to do.
All right. This is about our last question. We're getting close to our time here. What do you believe is the biggest misconception about Amelia or Amelia's life?
I think I would rephrase that and put it, sort of talk about where the focus should be when we think about her. In my mind, there are almost two Amelia Earharts. There's the Amelia Earhart as she lived, as an aviator and as a feminist. And then there's Amelia Earhart, who is the center of a disappearance and the great unsolved mystery. And the people who are really interested in the disappearance are often not all that interested in Amelia Earhart herself. They're interested in the search. They want to find the plane. They want to find out what happened, what the fuel capacity was, where she went down. And I think they're missing something. And so what I always try and do is, without denying the mystery and the compelling nature of that last flight, is to try and redirect attention to what she was able to accomplish in her life. And I think that's really what she would have wanted, and that's how I would like to remember her.
Very good. Okay, we're all done.
Thank you, Susan, for that incredible perspective on the life of one of our nation's heroes and leaders. Certainly, I learned a great deal and a lot to take away, so thank you for that opportunity. I want to thank Pratt & Whitney for the support of this program. Without that support, we wouldn't be able to convene. And I want to thank all of you for spending your time, whether online or in person, and joining us for this really wonderful occasion to learn more about the life of Amelia Earhart. Our time is perishable, and the fact that you chose to spend it with us this evening is a gift, and we thank you for that. I hope the rest of your evening is safe and enjoyable, and the best way out of this dark theater is through the exit to the rear and top of the theater. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Susan.